He held out a sealed letter and asked if she could be discreet. Charlotte Merritt took the letter with steady fingers and looked into the Duke of Wexford's face for the first time, and answered him in a voice that was already lying. "Discretion is the only thing I have ever sold, Your Grace. I trust the price will be acceptable." The Duke did not smile. He had not smiled once since she stepped into his study, and Charlotte counted that as the first useful piece of information she had gathered about Adrian Wexford. The fire snapped behind him. October light came thin and yellow through the long windows. On the desk between them sat a velvet tray of seal rings, a porcelain dish of pen grit, and a stack of ledgers tied with a black ribbon. The whole room smelled of orange peel and clove, autumn pomanders set in a brass bowl by the door, and beneath that, the colder note of beeswax and old paper. Adrian Wexford pressed his thumb against the small white scar on his left palm, a movement so brief she would have missed it if she had not been looking for it. Then he spoke. "You were hired by recommendation. I do not know whose. I asked the Lord Chancellor for a person of unusual skill, and he asked someone else, and that person sent me you. I should like to know nothing more about that chain. Is that acceptable to you, Miss Merritt?" "Entirely, Your Grace." "Good. Then I will tell you what I require." His voice was lower than the room. He held her eyes. "Letters have been leaving this house. Private letters, family letters. They have arrived at the desks of men who should not have read them. One of those letters cost the life of a friend of mine in Lisbon 2 months ago. Another nearly cost a treaty. I am not paranoid, Miss Merritt. I have proof. What I do not have is the name of the person in this household who is putting those letters in other hands. I want that name. I want it in 3 weeks." The pomanders by the door breathed clove and orange peel into the warm air between them. The fire shifted again. Somewhere on the floor above, a clock ticked through 3 small, tidy seconds. "Why 3 weeks, Your Grace?" "Because in 3 weeks, Parliament returns, and the man behind these leaks expects something from me he is not going to receive. After that, I become useful to him in ways I would prefer not to consider." Charlotte set the sealed letter back on the desk, untouched, the wax still whole. "And the cover? I cannot walk into Wexford Hall as an investigator and expect a careful traitor to remain careful." "The late Duchess's secretary post. My mother was lost to us in the spring. Her correspondence is unanswered. The household has been waiting for someone to take it on. You will be that someone. You will live here, you will sit at her desk. You will read her letters and write the polite refusals, and you will move through the house as a woman of small consequence who happens to be very tidy." A woman of small consequence. A woman whose smallness will be her cover. Yes. She did not flinch at that. She had heard worse and meant less, but she let her eyes stay on him for 1 second longer than she usually allowed, because she wanted him to feel it. The fact that his words had registered. The fact that he had not entirely meant them. The fact that he knew it. He held her gaze. He did not apologize. That was the second useful piece of information she had gathered about Adrian Wexford. "I will need every key in the house," she said. "I will need a desk in the late Duchess's morning room with a lock no one else has opened. I will need to be accepted by your housekeeper as her colleague, not her subordinate. And I will need you, Your Grace, to bring me into the library at 11:30 tomorrow morning, under the pretext of asking my opinion of a Latin epitaph." The room held its breath. Outside the long windows, a chestnut leaf turned once in the wind, and was gone. A flicker, not quite a smile, moved at the corner of his mouth. "An epitaph." You will bring 3. I will reject 2 and praise the 3rd for reasons that will sound informed. Your steward will hear of it by lunchtime. The whole house will assume I am clever in exactly the way that hired secretaries are sometimes clever, which is to say, harmlessly. After that, Your Grace, you will not approach me in front of any servant for 10 days. 10 days. You will not be tempted to glance at me at dinner. You will not pause when you pass me in a corridor. You will not, on any account, ask me how the work is progressing, no matter what shape your impatience takes. If we are to find your traitor before Parliament returns, you must give me 10 days to become invisible. And if I cannot give you 10 days? Then you will have hired the wrong woman, Your Grace, and there is still time for you to find another. I will return to London this evening if you require it. He looked at her for a long moment. The fire snapped again. His thumb pressed once more, briefly, to the small white scar. 10 days, Miss Merritt. 10 days, Your Grace. She inclined her head and turned to go, and at the door she paused and added, in the same level voice, "And the friend in Lisbon. I am sorry." She did not wait for him to answer. She had already passed the threshold, when she heard him say, very quietly, behind her, "Thank you." It was the 3rd useful piece of information. The corridor beyond his study was longer than it appeared to be from inside the room, and colder, and the carpet, a faded indigo runner of the kind one inherited rather than purchased, made no sound under her boots. She walked the length of it with her shoulders held in the careful, neutral way she had practiced at 21 in a back room in Westminster, and she thought, as she walked, about 3 things in disciplined sequence. The scar on the Duke's palm and the small, repeated press of his thumb against it. The phrase, "One of those letters cost the life of a friend of mine in Lisbon," and the way his voice had not lifted when he said it, the way the words had been reported rather than felt. And the silence after she had said, "I'm sorry." The long second before he said, "Thank you," in which the man on the other side of the desk had decided, in some private and probably consequential way, that she was not the kind of secretary the Lord Chancellor had described to him. She paused at the second window of the corridor. October light came through in long, pale bands across the carpet, the kind of light that made dust visible against polished oak. And beyond the glass, the kitchen garden was being dug for the last time before frost. 2 gardeners worked in slow, companionable rhythm, their breath silver in the cold air. She watched them for the time it took to count to 9. Then she walked on. Wexford Hall held its autumn the way only old houses could, patiently, with wood smoke in the curtains and harvest dust on the back of every picture frame. Charlotte unpacked her trunk in the late Duchess's morning room, while a maid named Anne hovered in the doorway, uncertain whether to help or leave her. Charlotte solved it by asking for 2 more lamps and a kettle, which sent Anne running, and then she sat down at the writing desk and surveyed the room properly for the first time. The desk had 3 drawers. The middle drawer was locked. The lock was a Bramah. The Bramah was new. She closed her eyes for 1 second and breathed out. New locks were sometimes evidence of grief. A son sealing his mother's last letters away from prying staff. New Bramah locks, however, were evidence of money and method, and a man who put a Bramah on the drawer of a recently lost woman in October had reasons that were not entirely sentimental. She opened her eyes. She permitted herself a small, private smile. Then she dipped her pen and began to write a perfectly polite reply to a vicar in Wiltshire who had inquired, 3 months too late, whether the Dowager Duchess of Wexford might attend the consecration of his new bell tower. She had written 4 such letters when the morning room door opened, and a person of approximately 4 feet 8 inches walked in without announcing herself. The person had a smudge of jam on her chin. She wore an emerald wool pinafore over a cream blouse, and her hair was the same dark gold as the late Duchess's portrait above the fireplace. "You're the new secretary," said the person. "I'm Pippa. You were not supposed to be here until Tuesday, but here you are. Mrs. Harkness is furious because the bedrooms are not aired. Are you the kind of person who is going to be cross about that?" "I'm not." "Good. Are you the kind of person who is going to make me practice the pianoforte?" "I'm not that either." "Excellent." Pippa crossed the room and put her elbows on the desk. "Are you married?" "No." "Do you intend to be?" "Not at present, Miss Pippa." "Are you in love with my uncle?" "I have met him for 19 minutes, Miss Pippa, and most of those 19 minutes were spent receiving instructions about envelopes." Pippa nodded sagely, as though this were a known hazard. "He is very tall and unmarried, and the cook says he is the saddest unmarried duke in 3 counties, so people will ask. I just thought I would ask first, before they did, because I like to know." Charlotte set down her pen. She regarded the small, sticky witness across the desk with something that came surprisingly close to delight. "Miss Pippa, may I ask you a professional question?" "You may." "In your considered opinion, who in this house is the cleverest person at being underestimated?" Pippa thought about it. She tilted her head. The jam smudge moved with her chin. "Mrs. Harkness," she said. "She pretends she does not understand French, and she understands all of it. Cousin Stephen says rude things in French at dinner sometimes, and Mrs. Harkness pours his soup very slowly. Then there is old Galt. That's the steward. But he is mostly underestimated because he is asleep. And there is Uncle Adrian, but he is underestimated by people who have never met him, and once they meet him, they are not underestimating him anymore, so I do not count him." "Thank you, Miss Pippa. That is extremely useful." "Will you tell me what it is for?" "No." "Excellent. I shall not press." Pippa straightened her pinafore with the dignity of a small ambassador. "I shall like you. I have decided. You may use my decision in conversation if it is helpful to you." She left as suddenly as she had arrived. Charlotte, alone, allowed herself 2 seconds of unprofessional laughter, and then dipped her pen again. Mrs. Harkness, French. Cousin Stephen, French. Old Galt, sleeping. Adrian Wexford, not underestimated by anyone with eyes. She wrote it down in a code that looked, to a passing reader, like a list of bell tower vicars. The library at 11:30 the next morning smelled of old leather and the river. Charlotte had not seen the river yet. It was somewhere beyond the long south windows, behind a screen of yellowing limes. But she could smell its autumn bitterness on the cold air, and she stored that fact away as well. Adrian was already there when she entered, 3 small slips of paper in his hand, and a face composed for the benefit of the steward standing 2 paces behind him. "Miss Merritt, I'm told you read Latin." "A little, Your Grace." "I have 3 possible epitaphs for the Dowager's monument. I should value your opinion." "I am at your service, Your Grace." He passed other slips. She read the first with the attentive solemnity of a woman pretending to deliberate. She read the second the same way. She lingered on the third, a clean, simple line about constancy, and looked up. "This one, Your Grace, without question." "You are certain?" "The first is over-elaborate and will read as a man's grief rather than a woman's life. The second is borrowed from Cicero, and will be recognized by every scholar in the diocese, which is a kind of theft your mother would not have countenanced. This one says nothing it cannot prove. Your mother's monument should not lie. Behind Adrian's left shoulder, old Master Galt, the steward, 68 years of household memory pressed into a stooped man with a wool muffler, made a soft, approving sound. Adrian inclined his head. Then this one shall stand. Thank you, Miss Merritt. Your eye is welcome. She curtsied. She left. By lunchtime, as predicted, the entire below-stairs population of Wexford Hall had been informed that the new secretary was clever, in the way that hired secretaries were sometimes clever, which was to say, harmlessly. It was the 11th useful thing Charlotte had done since arriving, and the 3rd arranged for Galt's particular ears. Hampshire in late October was a country undressing itself slowly. The hedgerows were still green-edged at the base, but the upper branches had gone yellow and copper, and then begun the careful release of leaves. The lanes around Wexford Hall filled every morning with the damp, vegetable-sweet drift of beech and oak and hornbeam. The river beyond the limes ran slower and clearer at this season. Charlotte saw it once on a walk with Mrs. Harkness, who had taken her down through the orchard with the ostensible purpose of inspecting the still-room and the actual purpose of estimating Charlotte's character. And the river had been the colour of weak iron tea, slow against the willow roots. The whole landscape smelled of something lifting away. It was the kind of country a person could disappear into for a week without anyone inquiring after them. And Charlotte had, in her 3 days at the Hall, identified that fact about its character with a quiet professional satisfaction. The house itself ran on the precise rhythm of its routines. Tea at 11, postbag at 9:30 and 4, dinner at 6 in the family dining room and at 5 in the servants' hall, candles lit by 3:30 on grey afternoons, the chapel bell at 7 on Sundays only. The kitchen made bread on Tuesdays and Fridays. Laundry was hung in the orchard on Mondays. The housekeeper's keys turned in their 3 locked cupboards in the same order every morning at 7. She catalogued each of these facts in her head, as she catalogued the floor plans and the staircases, and the unassuming back stairs that linked the morning room to the Duke's study, without passing through any space the family used. Every house had its public arteries and its private veins. In Wexford Hall, the veins were excellent. For 10 days, she was the most invisible person in Hampshire. She wrote 341 polite letters of refusal, regret, and acceptance. She rose early. She dined with the housekeeper rather than the family, a deliberate placement she had requested through Mrs. Harkness on her first evening, and which Mrs. Harkness, French quietly understood, had granted with a small approving nod. She walked the long corridors counting doors. She memorized the rotation of the house keys. She watched the postbag arrive at 9:30 each morning and depart at 4. She watched it from a distance. She never touched it. Touching it would have been the kind of mistake a real investigator made. On the 3rd evening, she made the small fake document. It was a folded sheet of cream paper, sealed with wax in a hand-cut device, a stag's head, 3 points only, deliberately unfamiliar, and inscribed in her own controlled hand with the words, "For His Grace's eye, by hand, urgent, Linhope." She did not address it to Adrian. She wrote his name nowhere on it. Anyone reading the seal would know to whom it should go. Anyone failing to deliver it to him would have failed a test that had nothing to do with literacy. She placed the sheet on the silver tray in the front hall at 9:01, where the steward took post each morning, and she watched, from the half-open door of the morning room, the precise route the tray took afterward. The tray went to Galt, Galt, slow-handed, took the false letter from the pile, examined it, and walked, without pausing, directly to the Duke's study. He returned without it. 3 minutes later, Adrian Wexford's bell rang in the kitchen. A footman was sent to the morning room to summon Miss Merritt to the study at her earliest convenience. She closed the door of the morning room behind her, smoothed her cuff once, and walked. Adrian was standing at the long windows with his back to her. The false letter sat open on his desk, the wax broken cleanly. He did not turn around when she entered. "I do not recognize this device, Miss Merritt." "I would be astonished, Your Grace, if you did. It is mine." He turned. He was not angry. He was something quieter and more dangerous. A man who had been handed a private mirror and was deciding whether to look into it. "Why?" "Because you said to me 10 days ago that you would not approach me, that you would not be tempted to glance at me, that you would not, on any account, ask me how the work was progressing. I needed to know whether your discipline was a habit or a performance. I needed to know whether, when a sealed letter arrived in this house from a name you would not entirely understand, you would do what a careful man does, or what an impatient man does. You have done what a careful man does. Now I can work. And if I had done otherwise, then I would have been packing my trunk by now, and you would be wondering why." He looked at her for a long moment without moving. He pressed his thumb, briefly, to the white scar. "You arrived knowing the house leaks letters. You needed to see whether I leaked discipline." "Yes, Your Grace." The fire snapped. A coal settled inside the grate, and a small shower of red sparks rose against the back wall of the hearth. "Has anyone else ever tested me, Miss Merritt?" "Many people, Your Grace. None who would have admitted it to your face." "I am not certain whether to dismiss you for impertinence or double your wage." "Either decision will tell me a great deal, Your Grace." A long, unhurried breath. He folded the false letter once, twice, and dropped it into the fire. The flame caught and turned green for one moment from the pigment in the wax. He watched it burn. She watched him watch it. "Tell me what you have learned." "The leak is not Galt. Galt would not have walked the false letter directly to your study. He would have left it on the silver tray for half an hour to let the housekeeper note its arrival, which is the protocol the late Duchess established. Galt walked it directly because Galt is a man who understands urgency, but does not understand performance. He has nothing to perform. He is no longer afraid of being underestimated. A leak is, almost always, a person who is still trying to prove something. So, not Galt." "Mrs. Harkness?" "Mrs. Harkness understands 4 languages, and 3 of them are the kind of languages a housekeeper of her income should not understand. But she protects this house with a concentrated, almost violent loyalty I cannot fake even if I tried." "No." "Then who?" "I am not yet certain, but I know what to look for now. I know your discipline, Your Grace. I needed it for a baseline." "A baseline for what?" She held his gaze. "A baseline for the contrast that will betray your traitor. Whoever is leaking from this house, Your Grace, has been getting away with it because they know how steady you are. They have built their pattern around the assumption that you do not vary. The day they do something that varies, and they will if I press correctly, I will see it, because I have seen the constant." He was silent for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "You are not a secretary." "No, Your Grace, I am not." The green after-image from the burning seal still hung in the corners of the room. The fire had returned to its ordinary orange. What are you? A woman of small consequence, hired by a chain of recommendations you have agreed not to investigate. I should remind you of your own terms. He almost laughed. The corner of his mouth moved. Miss Merritt. Your Grace. A pause she did not fill. Stay. I had no intention of leaving. She left the study with the green after-image of the burning seal still in her vision, and a quiet, surprising warmth in her chest she did not have the time to examine. The cousin's name was Stephen Wexford. He was 31, unmarried, well-dressed in a way that announced an interest in being looked at, and he arrived at Wexford Hall every Friday for the harvest dinners and stayed through Sunday morning. He had been the heir presumptive until Adrian, 2 years before the story now begins, had survived a wound at the close of a long war that everyone had expected to take him. Pippa had told Charlotte this, between bites of an apple in the kitchen garden. Cousin Stephen was very kind to Mamma when Uncle Adrian was on campaign, Pippa had said. He visited every week. He brought her a glass parrot. He cried at her funeral. I do not think he is a bad person. I think he is a person who is sad in the wrong shape. That is an unusually exact diagnosis, Miss Pippa. It is something Mrs. Harkness said. I borrowed it. It is good prose. You may keep it. That Friday, Stephen Wexford arrived at 5 in the afternoon, in a dove-grey coat lined with pale rose silk that flashed when he turned. He was handsome. Charlotte had been told he would be, and Charlotte never doubted her information. Handsome in the careful, surface way that only people with leisure could afford. He kissed Pippa on the top of the head, bowed to Mrs. Harkness in French, and then, in the great hall, he stopped. And this, he said in English, must be the new secretary. He smiled. The smile reached only the lower half of his face. Miss Merritt, said Charlotte, with the curtsy of a person of small consequence. How charming, said Stephen Wexford. To have a young woman of taste in the morning room at last. My aunt would have approved. You must be exhausted by my cousin's correspondence, however. He is, I am afraid, a man of unrelenting precision. He is, sir. Do you find precision a little tiring? No, sir. I find it restful. A flicker of something, a recalibration, moved across Stephen's face, before he covered it with a wider, warmer smile. Restful. How charming. How charming and how exact. He bowed to her again, slightly, and moved on, and Charlotte watched him go with the calm certainty of a woman who had just heard the first false note in a complicated piece of music. She wrote 3 lines of code in the morning room ledger that night. Stephen W. Speaks French with the housekeeper, English with the help. Charm pitched to register the listener's response. Recalibrates fast. Comfortable in this house. Knows the rhythms. Does not know I do. Then she wrote, beneath those 3 lines, a single word. Watch. For the next 4 days she wrote 2 ledgers. The visible one was the late Duchess's correspondence book. 347 letters now. A marvel of progress, Mrs. Harkness had remarked. The invisible one she carried in her head, and committed to paper only at night, in a folded sheet that lived inside the spine of a Latin grammar she had brought from London precisely because no one would think to open it. In the invisible ledger, Stephen Wexford was patient 0. He moved through Wexford Hall as a man who had once expected to inherit it. He paused, sometimes, in doorways, for half a second longer than a casual visitor would, the way a child raised in a house pauses in rooms he has not been allowed into for a long time. He asked the housekeeper familiar questions. He asked the cook intimate questions. He never asked Adrian anything. He treated Adrian with a layered, public courtesy that contained beneath it a quieter, more private resentment, the way an old wound contains the faint memory of the blade. On the third Sunday, Charlotte found what she had been looking for. It was a small, careful theft. Adrian's private writing case, a tooled leather portfolio that lived on the desk in his study when he was in residence, had been opened, and its third compartment lifted out, examined, and returned. The compartment was meant for letters in transit. There had been 4 letters in it that morning, sealed and ready for the 4 o'clock postbag. There were still 4 letters in it now, but the second of the 4 was very faintly off-center, as though it had been replaced with a fraction less care than the original placement, and the wax, which Charlotte had personally watched Adrian press at 3:30 the afternoon before, bore on the lower edge a hairline crack, consistent with the expansion of warmed wax under a thin, hot blade. She did not break the seal. She did not need to. She knew already what was happening. The seal was being lifted, the letter copied, the original resealed, and the postbag was riding to its honest destination, with its dishonest twin already in transit by another route. She returned to the morning room. She did not speak to Adrian. She wrote instead 3 new lines in the invisible ledger. Method confirmed. Heat blade reseal. Daytime access. Between 3:30 and 3:50, after His Grace seals the post, and before the steward collects it. 20 minutes. Anyone in the house could enter the study. Only one person both could and would. Beneath those 3 lines, now, the audit. She unfolded the second sheet of paper she had been carrying since London. It was a list of 7 items. 5 of them were the operational details of Adrian's leak. The mechanism, the timeline, the suspects, the proofs she had been hired by him to produce. They had taken her 11 days. The other 2 were not his. The other 2 were Lord Linhope's. They were the questions she had been sent, privately, by a man Adrian Wexford had never knowingly met, to answer about Adrian himself. Item 6. In a moment of forced choice, will the Duke of Wexford prefer his honour to his kin? Item 7. Has the war left him a man who can hold a crown's secret, or a man whose grief will leak it as readily as his cousin's vanity does? She refolded the sheet. She sat for a long time at the desk, listening to the rain begin, watching the grey light come in through the window. She thought, with a small, unwelcome clarity, that she had begun to like the man she was auditing. She told herself this was a manageable problem. She was not, yet, telling herself the truth. On the Monday, Adrian came into the morning room without knocking. He had not done so before. Charlotte looked up from a letter to a baroness in Bath and waited for him to speak. "You have been avoiding me for 6 days, Miss Merritt." "I have not, Your Grace. I have been working in the building you also live in, which is entirely different from avoidance." "You have not come to the study since the green flame." "I had nothing to report that was worth interrupting you for." He came further into the room. He did not sit. The ceiling was low here. The morning room was a pretty, plastered place, not designed for tall men, and the way he had to angle his head slightly to stand without grazing a beam made him look, for one absurd moment, like a man caught inside a room that had not anticipated him. Charlotte put her pen down. "Have you discovered anything?" "I have. I'm going to tell you. But I'm going to tell you when I am ready, and not before, and not because of your impatience. We agreed on this, Your Grace." He looked at her. The scar on his palm, the thumb, the careful, restrained pressure of a man choosing whether to be honest. A long second of nothing, of small sounds, the kettle in the kitchen below, a lark somewhere in the cold field beyond the window. Then he said, with surprising gentleness, "I'm not impatient about the leak, Miss Merritt. I am impatient about something else, and I have just realized what it is. And I would like to leave this room before I say something I have no business saying. Forgive me." He turned. He was halfway to the door when she heard her own voice say, "Your Grace." He stopped. "Sit down." He did not sit. He did, however, turn around. "I will tell you about the leak when I am ready," Charlotte said, and her voice was steady, the way it had been the first time she sold him a discretion. The way it always was. "But I will tell you something else, now, in advance of payment, because it is owed and not bought. I've been in this house for 11 days. In that time, I have written 371 letters, none of which contained a true sentence. And I have kept 2 ledgers, one of which would hang me if it were read. I am very good at being a woman of small consequence, Your Grace. It is a profession. I've been doing it since I was 21. I am 26 now. In all the rooms I have ever audited, I have never wished, even for one inconvenient afternoon, that the man across the desk would look at me longer than was professionally useful. Do you understand the report I am making?" He did not move. "Yes," he said. "Good. Now, I will tell you about the leak when I am ready. Not before. Not because you came into the morning room without knocking. Goodbye, Your Grace." She picked up her pen. He went to the door. At the door he stopped and said, without turning, "Thank you, Charlotte." It was the first time he had used her given name. He did not wait to see whether she allowed it. The door closed. She stared at the page in front of her for a long time, until the rain on the window stopped, and then she dipped her pen and wrote a perfectly grammatical refusal to a duchess in Yorkshire who wished to discuss the sale of a small Hampshire farm. The clock on the morning room mantel struck 12. The kitchen below sent up a small, ordinary clatter of pans being set out for lunch. The world had not, in any visible way, altered. Charlotte Merritt, who had spent 14 years training herself to notice exactly which alterations were visible and which were not, set down her pen with hands that had begun, very faintly, to shake. And that fact, she thought, with the small, unprofessional honesty she was beginning to allow herself in this house, was the 5th or 6th useful piece of information she had gathered about herself. The Harvest Ball at Merryworth Park was held on the last Saturday of October. It was the kind of country event that pretended to be small, and was not. 300 candles, 2 violins, a viola, and a rented pianoforte. A garland of dried wheat and hops over the door. A fire of applewood in the great hearth. A punch bowl of something autumnal, ruby-coloured, and stronger than it looked. Charlotte attended on the Duke of Wexford's arm, in the role her cover required. The late Duchess's secretary, brought along because the Duke required someone to manage the cards of introduction, and the carriage list, and the inevitable obligations of an autumn evening. She had borrowed a peacock blue silk gown from a friend in London for precisely this occasion. The silk was the deep, layered blue of a peacock's neck, an unrespectable colour for a secretary, an exact colour for the kind of woman she was when she was not pretending to be one. She had pinned her hair simply. She wore one set of pearls. Adrian saw her at the foot of the great staircase and stopped. "That is not," he said, "a secretary's gown." "It is the only one I had with me, Your Grace. that fits the temperature of the room. I am sorry if it inconveniences your cover story. It does not inconvenience my cover story, Miss Merritt. It inconveniences me. I shall consider that a professional risk you must absorb. He gave her his arm. The hand at his elbow was steady. The hand at her elbow was not. Not quite. She felt the small, uneven press of his thumb against the inside of her sleeve, and she filed it away beside the other small, uneven things she had filed away about him in the last 14 days. And she walked. They walked into the ball. Stephen Wexford, who had, naturally, attended, was already in conversation with the magistrate's wife by the punch bowl when they entered. The magistrate's wife, a Mrs. Vowell, 50, sharp-faced, dressed in a dark mulberry that did her no kindness, was a famous keeper of Hampshire memory. She kept it the way some women kept silverware, polished, catalogued, deployed at dinner. Stephen had positioned her where Adrian would have to pass to reach the punch. Charlotte saw the trap a full second before Adrian did. She did not change her stride. She did not warn him. She simply tilted her head a fraction toward Mrs. Vowell and said, in the conversational voice of a woman of small consequence, "Mrs. Vowell, I believe. My late employer spoke of you with great warmth. I should like, if I may, to be presented." It was a small, exact move. It rerouted the social geometry. Mrs. Vowell's attention was now on Charlotte. Stephen's small ambush, a question about the Duke's elder brother, who had not survived a different war, and whose name Stephen brought up at strategic intervals, was undeliverable to its target. Stephen, fluid, recovered. He turned his charm sideways onto Charlotte instead. "And how is my cousin's correspondence, Miss Merritt? I trust the late Duchess's vicars are being suitably consoled." "They are, sir. Vicars in Hampshire are a remarkably consolable population." "You make light of them." "I make polite of them. It is what they require from a secretary." "You are very quick, Miss Merritt." "I am paid to be tidy, sir, not quick. The tidiness is a side effect of having no other interests." It was the kind of line that closed a conversation rather than opened one. Stephen recognized it. He bowed, smile unaltered, and stepped away. Mrs. Vowell, who had been watching, gave Charlotte a long, considering look. "A side effect of having no other interests," Mrs. Vowell repeated. "How marvelously inaccurate of you, my dear. Whose secretary did you say you were?" "The Dowager Duchess of Wexford's, ma'am." "How peculiar. The Dowager's last secretary I knew was a Miss Carstairs, who married a clergyman in 1822. I was not aware she had been replaced." Mrs. Vowell smiled, the small, tight smile of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. "But of course, one does not always inform Hampshire of one's domestic arrangements. Forgive my curiosity. I am old and interested in other people's lives because I have outlived most of my own." The candles in the great hall above them moved on their iron chandelier. A fragment of melted wax fell, hissing, onto the stone of the fireplace, and was gone in a thread of white smoke. "There is no need to forgive curiosity, man. There is only a need to forgive carelessness. And you have not been careless." Mrs. Vowell laughed, actually laughed, a brief, surprised, almost girlish sound, and patted Charlotte's wrist. "I shall not press. I rather think I should not. You have a quality, my dear, that Stephen Wexford has noticed and does not yet understand. That is going to be amusing." Adrian, standing a careful 3 paces away with a glass of punch he had not yet tasted, stepped forward then. "Mrs. Vowell, you are well, I hope?" "I am well, Your Grace. I have just been entertained." You may keep your secretary." "I had no intention of relinquishing her, Mrs. Val." Mrs. Val gave him a long look that was less the look of a magistrate's wife, and more the look of a woman who had once known his mother. "Your hand has been at the small scar again. Do not let it. It tells the rest of us when you are deciding whether to be honest. You were always too easy to read, Adrian Wexford." She glided away. Adrian, very quietly, dropped his hand from the scar. "Was that," he said, "the worst possible witness in the room for what I am about to do?" "What are you about to do, Your Grace?" "Take you outside. I require a corridor, possibly a courtyard, anywhere this room is not." "Then we should leave by the door behind the violins. Mrs. Val will be too engaged in misreading us to notice." They went. The musicians had moved into a country dance with a bright, brisk pulse, and the warm bodies on the floor parted around them with the practiced social courtesy of a county that had been giving harvest balls for 200 years. No one stopped them. No one asked. The only person who watched them go was Mrs. Val, who continued, in deliberate counterpoint, to be misreading them at exactly the angle Charlotte had predicted. The courtyard at the back of Merryworth Park was small, walled, and lit by 2 iron lanterns. The air was cold. The smell of applewood from the hearth followed them out through the door and was replaced, in the courtyard, by the cleaner, sharper smell of the river beyond the orchard, the same autumn bitterness she had first smelled in the library on her second day. Adrian shut the door behind them. He did not let go of her arm. "I cannot do this in the corridor," he said. "Forgive me. The corridor will be observed." "Your Grace, what are you doing?" "Apologizing, I think." He looked down at her. The lantern light caught the scar on his palm, where his hand still lay against her elbow, and the small white line of it looked, in this light, like a wound that had healed cleanly and remembered nothing. "Charlotte, I asked the Lord Chancellor for a person of unusual skill. I expected him to send me a clerk. I have, instead, been given an audit." "Your Grace, I am not asking you to abandon your professional discipline. I'm not asking you to tell me the things you are not yet ready to tell me. I am, however, going to ask you a question, and I'm going to ask it once, and your answer is going to govern whether I escort you back into that ballroom and pretend I have done nothing tonight, or whether I do something quite different. May I?" The lantern flame to her left steadied, lengthened, and held. A thread of smoke rose from it as straight as a pin. From beyond the courtyard wall came the brief, distinct sound of a horse stamping in the stable yard and being quieted by a groom's hand. "You may, Your Grace." "In the morning room, 6 days ago, you said that in all the rooms you had audited, you had never wished a man would look at you longer than was professionally useful. Was that statement accurate this morning? Or was it accurate 10 days ago and inaccurate now?" She looked at him. The cold was real on her cheeks. The peacock silk caught the lantern. The scar on his palm was warm against her arm, and she could feel the small, uneven pulse of his thumb where his fingers held her, where he was, even in this, restraining himself. "It was accurate 10 days ago, Your Grace. It became inaccurate on the 3rd day." "Specifically?" "On the 3rd day I was watching from the morning room when you returned a child's lost glove to her at the gate. Specifically then." "Pippa says I never returned anything to her at the gate." "It was not Pippa. It was the cook's daughter. Pippa would not have lost a glove." He looked at her. His face changed in a way she could not have written down precisely afterwards. A softening, a kind of tired delight, and she felt the small professional door inside her, which she had been holding open for an exit, close cleanly. Charlotte. Your Grace. The lantern light moved across her face. It moved across his. It moved across the small, exact distance between them, which was less than 3 inches and more than nothing, and which was, by the standards of 2 adult people in a walled courtyard with the door closed behind them, extremely large. I am not going to kiss you in this courtyard. I am pleased to hear it, Your Grace. The cook's daughter would lose her place in 3 days if you did, and a magistrate's wife had heard about it. A small, rueful breath that was almost a laugh. I am, however, going to take you home. That, Your Grace, is acceptable. He let go of her arm. He offered her his coat against the cold. She did not refuse it. They walked back to the carriage, slowly, together, and she carried the lantern smell in the wool of his coat all the way back to Wexford Hall, and the door of the small professional compartment inside her stayed shut for the entire drive. The carriage ride was 9 miles. She had ridden in many carriages, with many men in many useful coats, on roads of various conditions, in service of various commissions, and she had, in nearly every case, spent the journey reviewing in her head the exact next sequence of professional steps. She did not, on this drive, do that. She sat with her hands folded inside the cuffs of his greatcoat. They were too long for her, the wool warm at her wrists, where his own wrists had warmed it earlier. And she watched the harvest moon, low and ochre, slip behind a screen of trees, and then emerge again on the other side, as the carriage made the long bend at Merryworth Cross. Adrian sat opposite her, with his ungloved hand resting on his knee, deliberately not touching her, in the careful posture of a man who had said what he meant to say, and now intended to honor the answer. He did not speak. She did not require him to. The wheels made the small, even sound of well-greased iron on packed earth, and the lamps at the front of the carriage cast their narrow yellow road across the hedgerow, and somewhere, distantly at the eastern edge of the parish, a church bell sounded the hour, 3 thin, clean strokes, and the silence resumed. Charlotte realized, on the second of those strokes, that she was, for the first time since the age of 19, in the company of a man whose silence she did not feel obliged to interpret. She filed this against the other findings of the evening, and then, with the unhurried internal honesty she had earned the right to over 14 years, she let it become the only finding that mattered. The trap closed 3 days later. It closed in the form of a stolen ledger that surfaced at the Lamb and Flag, a coaching inn 6 miles south of Wexford Hall, where a man named Pomeroy, a junior clerk of the magistrate's office, whom Stephen Wexford had been quietly cultivating for 9 months, produced it as evidence that Adrian's correspondence had been, for some time, the source of a series of leaks that had reached unfriendly hands. The ledger was Adrian's. The handwriting was unmistakably his. The dates were correct. The contents were correct. The cover of the ledger bore, in pencil, just inside the leather, the small, careful initials, C.M. Pomeroy delivered it to a senior magistrate at 3 in the afternoon. By 5, 2 riders were at Wexford Hall, a junior officer of the Crown, and Mr. Val. Yes, that Mr. Val, the magistrate's husband, a careful and unhappy man of 52, who had not wanted to come, and had come anyway. The afternoon had gone the color of wet pewter, low cloud pressing against the upper windows of the hall, the long limes outside the library shedding their last copper leaves into a thin, grey wind. The house had been quiet since lunch, Charlotte had felt the quiet against her skin, the way she sometimes felt rain on the back of her neck before it began. A small, alert, animal awareness that something was about to happen that she had not yet seen. She had been at her desk in the morning room, finishing a letter to a vicar in Salisbury, when she had heard, distinctly, the unfamiliar rhythm of 2 horses arriving at speed, and the sharper, anxious tone of Mrs. Harkness in the front hall, the housekeeper's voice rising once and then settling again into its usual disciplined level. Her pen had stopped moving. She had set it carefully in its rest. She had reached, almost without thinking about it, for the Latin grammar that lived on the second shelf of the bookcase to her left, and she had taken from inside its spine the folded sheet of her invisible ledger, and she had, without hurry, without flinching, with the precise, methodical calm of a woman who had been preparing for this moment for 13 years, and had once, at the age of 21, sworn never again to be caught with her notes in a place a stranger could reach, slipped that folded sheet inside the bodice of her dress, beneath the linen, against her ribs, where it stayed warm against her skin while she walked, with a steady step, into the front hall. Charlotte was in the morning room when the riders arrived. She heard them. She heard Mrs. Harkness, who never raised her voice, raise her voice once. She heard Adrian's tread on the stairs. She closed the late Duchess's correspondence book. She slid the invisible ledger out of the spine of the Latin grammar and put it inside the bodice of her dress, beneath the linen, against her ribs. She walked, calmly, into the front hall. "Miss Merritt," said Mr. Vowell, "I am sorry. We have a matter that requires your attendance in the study." "Of course, sir." She went to the study. Adrian was already there. So was Stephen Wexford, who had, naturally, arrived from London in time to witness the moment. So was the junior officer, holding the ledger at the half-respectful angle of a man unsure whose property he was holding. So was Mrs. Vowell, who had come, she said, because she was the only person in Hampshire who would notice if anyone's hands trembled. The ledger lay on the desk. The initials C.M. were visible. "Your Grace," said Mr. Vowell, "you have been accused by an informant of being the source of correspondence that has reached unfriendly parties. The evidence is this ledger, written in your hand, and these initials, which we have been advised refer to your secretary, Miss Charlotte Merritt, who is alleged to have been the conduit by which copies of your correspondence have left this house. We would prefer, sincerely, to be told that this is a misunderstanding." "It is," said Adrian. "A misunderstanding." "Your Grace, the evidence is a fabrication." Adrian did not raise his voice. He did not look at Stephen. He looked at Charlotte. "Miss Merritt, will you, before this company, permit me to say several things on your behalf, which I am not, technically, in a position to know?" She held his eyes. "You are not, Your Grace, in a position to know them." "I am going to say them anyway. I am going to be wrong, in places, and you will correct me publicly when I am, because I will not survive being wrong on your behalf and not knowing it." "Speak, Your Grace." He turned to the magistrate. He spoke in the calm, exact voice of a man who has decided, irrevocably, what he is going to choose. "Miss Merritt was hired by me through the Lord Chancellor's office for the purpose of locating the person in this house who has been intercepting and copying my correspondence. She has done so. The person is in this room. He has, at some point in the last 3 days, removed a ledger from my private case, copied it imperfectly, replaced it, and lodged the imperfect copy with Mr. Pomeroy of your office for the purpose of accusing me through her. Miss Merritt's initials are inside that copy because Miss Merritt and I, last week, conducted a small piece of mutual record-keeping, a piece of which I am now grateful, which has the effect of placing those initials on certain pages of the original. Whoever copied the ledger did not know to leave them out. The original is in my desk, and the original does not match the ledger you are holding. You may compare them. I should be grateful, Your Grace, if we could. Adrian unlocked the second drawer of the desk and laid out the original ledger. The two were placed side by side. The discrepancy was visible, small, but undeniable. The copyist had been hurried. He had reproduced the dates and the contents, but he had failed to reproduce a single annotation in Charlotte's hand on page 11, where she had marked, in pencil, the precise time of an evening seal. Two pieces of evidence, 6 minutes apart, that no copyist working from a quick lift of the ledger could have known to imitate. The room was silent. Stephen Wexford laughed, once, a thin, dry laugh that he tried to make charming and could not. Adrian, this is absurd. You are accusing me of... The room held the small, awful silence of a moment in which a respected family did its private accounting in front of strangers. The fire on the hearth had been allowed to burn down to a lower red. The smell of the apple wood was still there, slightly singed now at the edges, and the porcelain Pengrit dish on the desk caught the failing light like a small white moon. I am not accusing you of anything, Stephen. The magistrate is. I have merely provided him with the evidence. You have, this evening, been more careful about what you say next than you have been at any moment since you entered this house tonight. Stephen looked at him. He looked at Mr. Vow. He looked at Mrs. Vow, who was watching him with the cold attention of a woman who had once known his mother as well. He looked briefly at Charlotte, and he saw, for the first time, what his cousin had seen weeks earlier. The woman across the desk was not a secretary of small consequence. I have, he said, in a voice that was suddenly very young. Nothing further to say at this time. Then come with me, Mr. Wexford, said Mr. Vowell gently. I am very sorry, Your Grace. So am I, Mr. Vowell. Be kind to him. He was, until very recently, a person I loved. They left. The junior officer carried the false ledger. Mrs. Vowell, at the door, paused and turned back to Adrian. I am no longer an unhelpful witness, Your Grace. I should like to apologize for my husband having required the visit at all. You were never an unhelpful witness, Mrs. Vowell. No, I was not. She turned to Charlotte. She inclined her head, a small, formal gesture, the kind older women reserve for younger women they have decided to take seriously. Miss Merritt, whatever you actually do for a living, you do it with great care. She left. Charlotte and Adrian were alone in the study. The fire snapped. The October light, what was left of it, had gone the color of weak tea. The two ledgers sat side by side on the desk, the original and its imperfect twin. Charlotte. Your Grace? Will you sit down? I will. She sat. He sat opposite her. He pressed his thumb once to the small white scar. The two ledgers lay between them on the polished oak, the original and its imperfect twin, and the late afternoon had collapsed into the low, rust-colored light that came through the long windows on October evenings only. Somewhere in the front of the house, a door closed. Somewhere outside, a single pigeon flew up out of the lime trees and resettled. You owe me, he said, a report. I do. Make it. She breathed in once and made it. She told him about the heat blade reseal. She told him about the 20-minute window between 3:30 and 3:50. She told him about Stephen's pauses in doorways, about the recalibration of his charm, about the false letter and the green flame, and Galt, and Mrs. Harkness, and the cook, and Pippa. Then she told him about Lord Linhope. You knew the leak was Stephen by the 3rd Sunday, Your Grace. I had 4 answers ready for you within 14 days. I have been able to give you those answers since the morning room conversation 11 days ago. I delayed. Why? Because I had a second commission. I was sent, Your Grace, by Lord Linhope. Through the chain of recommendation neither of us was supposed to investigate, for the additional purpose of determining whether the Duke of Wexford could be trusted with a confidential matter that the Crown is presently considering offering him. Item 6 of my brief was, in a moment of forced choice, will the Duke prefer his honour to his kin? Item 7 was, has the war left him a man who can hold a secret? I have, of course, both answers now. He looked at her. And what did you tell Lord Linhope? She placed the letter on the desk between them, with the care of a woman setting down a thing she had been carrying for too long. Outside the long windows, the limes had begun, in the grey light, to catch a single colder wind, and a flock of starlings that had been feeding in the orchard rose all at once and shifted across the sky like a held breath. I have not yet told him anything, Your Grace. The post bag does not leave until 4. The letter is in my hand. He did not move. The fire snapped. She slid the letter across the desk. He read it. It was 4 lines long. It said, Item 6 answered in the affirmative. Item 7 answered in the affirmative. The Duke is the man you require. He is not the man I expected. I am withdrawing from your service in this matter, with thanks for the introduction, and with a request that you find another agent for the next audit of his life. C.M. He set the letter down. He pressed his thumb to the scar. He did not look at the letter again. Why are you withdrawing? Because I cannot serve a patron whose interests in you may not, in some future month, align with mine. Because the report I have just sent him is the last honest report I am willing to write about you to anyone. Because I have been auditing you for 14 days, Your Grace, and on the 3rd day my findings became, in places, my preferences. Charlotte. Your Grace. I am going to say something now that I should have said the night you wore peacock silk, and Mrs. Vowell told me to take my hand off the scar. I am going to ask you, in the formal language of a man asking a question he means in earnest, whether you will marry me. I am going to ask it, knowing perfectly well that you will not respond in the formal language. I am, however, going to require an answer. She looked at him. The scar, the thumb, the small exact pressure of restraint. Your Grace, I will marry you on 3 conditions. Name them. 1. I keep my correspondence. I will continue to write, for myself, by my own choice, and only for matters my own conscience approves. And you will not ask me what I am writing or for whom. There will be times when I cannot tell you. You will live with that. So will I. Acceptable. 2. I will not be a woman of small consequence in this house. The morning room will be mine. I will manage the late Duchess's foundation, which I have already half redesigned in my head, and I will manage it as a public position. Hampshire will know what I do. Acceptable. 3. You will never again, under any circumstance, ask me whether I passed my last audit on you. The answer will always be yes. The question will occasionally be insulting. We will speak of other things." He almost laughed. "Acceptable. Then yes, Your Grace. Adrian. Adrian." He did not stand. He did not come around the desk. He reached across it, across the ledgers, across the ink pots, across the porcelain dish of pen grit, and took her hand, and laid it open, and pressed his thumb very gently to the small line of skin at the base of her own palm, where there was no scar at all. "Did I pass, Charlotte?" "You passed before I knew I was watching, Adrian. It has been the inconvenience of my professional life." "And now?" "Now," she said, and her voice did not lie, "you are the only inconvenience I would like to keep." He smiled. It was the first time. It changed his face. It was the fourth and final useful piece of information she had gathered about Adrian Wexford. 4 months later, in late February, when the river beyond Wexford Hall was still half-iced and the limes were bare, Charlotte stood in the morning room, still hers, still locked by a Brahma no one else had the key to, and looked at the small velvet tray of seal rings on the desk in the corner. There was a new ring on the tray, a simple, unbeautiful thing, her initials inside a band of unornamented gold that she used to seal her own correspondence. There was also, beside it, a single sealed letter that she had not yet placed in the post bag. The letter was addressed to her husband. She had written it that morning. It said, "Adrian, I have decided, after careful audit, to accept the Crown's offer. I will be in London on the 3rd Tuesday of every month for 5 days. I will tell you nothing about the work, and you will not ask. I love you," which is not relevant to the post bag, but is, I think, relevant to the desk it will arrive on. Charlotte. She placed the letter in his private writing case in the 3rd compartment where letters in transit lived. She did not seal it. He would seal it when he found it, at 3:30 the following afternoon, and the wax would be his, and the device would be his, and the post bag would carry it on to her own desk in London, where she would read what he had added beneath her 4 lines, and she would smile, in her chair, with the windows of her own private office open onto the cold February air. She closed the writing case. She closed the lid of the desk. She walked, in the warm yellow lamplight of her own morning room, past the brass bowl of pomanders by the door, clove and orange peel, the same scent he had first noticed on her fingers 19 weeks earlier, and out into the corridor of the house she had been hired to investigate. The corridor smelled of wood smoke and beeswax, and faintly, from the kitchen, of bread. Pippa, 10 years old now, was sitting on the bottom of the staircase reading a book. She looked up. "Aunt Charlotte, are you going for a walk?" "I am, Miss Pippa. Are you going to be cross when I tell Mrs. Harkness that Uncle Adrian was reading your book in his study and made a small mark in pencil on page 41? "I shall not be cross. I shall make him buy me another." "Excellent." Pippa returned to her book. Then, without looking up, she added, "I knew you were not really a secretary, from the very first afternoon. Did you know I knew?" "I suspected, Miss Pippa." "Good. I should hate to have been wrong. Are you a secret now?" "I am the kind of secret, Miss Pippa, that one keeps in the family." "Excellent," Pippa said again, sagely, and turned the page. Charlotte walked out into the autumn-stripped February garden, and in the cold air she saw, against her will, the tiny, beautiful flicker of green flame she would carry, for the rest of her life, in the back of her vision. The color of a wax seal burning. The colour of a lie chosen and burned. The colour of the moment a man she had been hired to test had decided to be honest with her instead. She walked toward the river. The river was the bitter, clean smell of autumn that lasted, in this house, all the way through to spring. She had been hired to find a traitor. She had found, instead, the man she was going to grow old with, and a profession she did not, in the end, have to give up to keep him. She had also, somewhere along the way, stopped lying with her voice. It had taken 19 weeks. It would take, she suspected, the rest of a long, complicated, unbeautifully exact life to keep doing it. She turned back after a while and walked toward the house. The pomanders were still warm. If you have ever walked into a room expecting to do one job and found, somewhere between the 3rd Sunday and the 14th letter, that the actual job had quietly redrafted itself around you, tell me about it in the comments. I read every one of them. And if Charlotte and Adrian have made you want one, this video will keep them coming. Good night from Adrian's fireside.